Welcome to Off Panel.
Welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Drifter, Black Cloud, and the upcoming Verses at Image Comics. It's Ivan Brandon. Thanks for coming on, Ivan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this chat is mostly going to be about Verses, your new book with Esad Ribic, Nic Klein, Tom Mueller, and a few other folks. But I wanted to start with talking about your path to comics because I thought it was particularly interesting. I was reading some old interviews you'd done, and I thought it was really fascinating. When did you first start getting into comics as a fan?
I actually started pretty young. I tend to be all over the place in terms of my interests. So I never really went in as whole hog as some, but I started probably when I was about, I think I got my first comic when I was 8. My grandmother put a weird copy of the Hulk in my stocking, and I think she just, one of those things she bought at the gas station kind of thing. Like, I don't think she knew what it was, and she had any inclination with it. And all I remember was the Hulk was wearing it was one of those times, I guess, not that I followed a ton of the Hulk, but the Hulk, that Banner had control of the Hulk. And so the Hulk is just dressed in like a lab outfit, talking, just an erudite Hulk. But yeah, I had been reading on and off through most of my life up to like high school. My mom weirdly ended up getting herself subscriptions to a bunch of Marvel comics at some point, which is really strange for my mom's an immigrant who was at the time a lawyer, single mom of 5. So if you can imagine an immigrant Cuban lawyer woman getting subscriptions to the New Mutants for herself. It was an interesting childhood, but me and my older brother mostly, but my little brother also would catch up to it. We read comics when we had access to them, and we'd buy them at that time. You could still buy them I say at that time as if I'm 90 years old, but you could still buy them sort of in a bodega, in a corner store kind of thing, and in the 80s, and we read, whatever we had access to. And sometimes, I know now it's more of a diehard collector mentality, but at that time, you didn't necessarily have access to everything. You just, whatever issues you could find, and sometimes there were gaps and you sort of had to figure it out.
Yeah.
I read there until probably right around high school, and then I sort of dropped it for, to pay attention to girls. And I came back to it right around the very end of the 90s, not like past what people consider to be the 90s in terms of the era.
Right.
But into the beginning of like where the modern era of like, why am I forgetting the
Vertigo?
Marvel Knights, that kind of stuff.
Oh, Marvel Knights, yeah.
And just sort of when the Vertigo, but like more like the result of Vertigo, where just modern mainstream comics was starting to evolve into this more quote unquote mature vessel, and you had more interesting, from my perspective, you had just a broader range of things that were possible than just sort of people punching each other. So I got a little bit further into it with that, and then I've been, when time allows, I've been pretty consistently reading since then.
Yeah. I think the amazing thing is you said you kind of first started reading when you're 8, but from what I understand, you actually studied art under David Mazzucchelli when you were 10?
Yeah.
How did that happen? I mean, granted, I live in Alaska where we don't really just have like legends just appearing on the streets of Brooklyn, but
most people don't have legends. David was a weird, interesting time, and I was 10, so I don't want to pretend to know what was going on in David's head at the time. But David had just started teaching, and I think I was literally in one of the first students he ever taught. And he decided to start teaching, and I was at a sort of artsy school when I was a kid, and this class suddenly appeared, this cartooning class. I don't remember how many of us that were in the class, maybe 10 people. And David Mazzucchelli was teaching it, and it was great because David, it was literally like heyday David, like it was maybe 2 years after year one or something.
Wow.
And or a year maybe, like it was really soon after, and he just sort of had quit comics.
Mm-hmm.
But was still enamored by the art and continues to teach to this day. So I think it's funny because I think it's weird in my older age, I guess, just having been a guy working in this business almost 20 years now. You can sort of see what seemed weird to me at the time, that someone would leave at the top of their game. Not that I'm ever at the top of my game, but it's interesting to see that I think he still loves the craft, which I do, but I tend to not be that interested in the culture of comics,
mm-hmm.
the comics. I find very frustrating. So you can almost get glimpses of possibly what might have sent him home in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's definitely had an interesting career, and it is I think that's kind of cool that he started, like in these days. I think, isn't he teaching at the School of Visual Arts?
Yeah, I think so. He was teaching at RISD for a while, and I saw him, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or something like that. And he said he was he's not there anymore, but I think he's still at SVA. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean it is kind of interesting to see like how his. I mean, like you're exactly right. Just you can see that he loves the art form because he's still teaching it and he's passing on his knowledge and things of that sort. But at the same time, the fact that, I mean, he's made Asterios Polyp and not really anything else in the last, I don't even know how long. And that's...
I think he's always tooling around on stuff, and I think Asterios Polyp he was working on for probably over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
He's not in any big hurry.
Sure.
I also think once you get anyone disconnected from the day-to-day of comics, it's very hard to... It's so time intensive,
right?
That to get someone to decide I'm going to just put aside whatever and work 10, 12 hours a day, it's tricky once they get away from it because It's not. It's emotionally satisfying maybe, but it's not physically. It's a real chore.
Do you think that there's like a certain level of like if you're immersed in it, it's easier to keep going versus like once you actually have some distance, you're like, how do I jump back into that?
Well, sure, but I think that's true of. I mean, that's true of positive and negative things too.
That's true.
You're in a bad marriage, and then you're finally you stick with it because it's all you know, and then eventually you get out of it. So that's one of those things. That, like, yeah, I think any good habits and bad habits are much easier to do when you're immersed in them. But with a little distance, it's easy to be like, yeah, I like this thing I'm doing now too.
Sure. So, from what I understand, you made your first comic when you were 10 as part of that class. But at what point did you realize that, you're reading comics, you take a bit of a gap in high school, you get back to them in your 20s. At what point did you realize that making comics was something that you actually wanted to pursue as a goal for you?
I honestly didn't. I didn't think of it. I never really thought of it that way. I mean, when I was a little kid, I did, but when I was a little kid, I was also drawing more.
Right.
And so I had a different perspective on what I would do. And I just really liked the comic art. And like a lot of fans, I just figured the next logical step to liking something is to do the thing, which as an adult makes a lot less sense to me. Just enjoy. I mean, honestly, working in different entertainment trades, you're like, oh, well, just like the thing. That's the most fun part.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'd never really thought of myself on the writer end. I'd been writing a lot of prose, and sort of the late '90s. There was the internet became a much bigger thing and became a much bigger thing for people who enjoyed the kind of comics that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the Warren Ellis forum, and you had the Bendis also had a forum, which morphed into a much bigger thing later, but. in the late '90s was this very sort of small community. I mean, big, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, he had hundreds of thousands of people in its ultimate form, and this wasn't that. There were probably maybe 100 of us.
Was it Bendis boards back then?
Yeah, I mean, it was called Jinx World.
Oh, okay, okay.
And there were a bunch of boards on there. And he, both of those ended up being just a great, I think for a lot of people who read comics at that time, or even before that, comics used to be a very solitary place, and it used to be a thing that you would do on your own. And if you were lucky, you knew one or two people who also read comics, but there wasn't really anyone to talk to about the things you liked. And the rare occasion that you'd find someone that did, it was like meeting some long lost brother or something. Like you were, oh my God, you liked Electro Assassin, or that kind of thing. You just had someone to talk about this weird thing that no one else knew about. Mm-hmm. So once that blew up on the internet, it ended up being huge. And the weird thing is, like not most, but I think of the people that I used to communicate with the most closely on both Bendis and Ellis's forum, most of those people are professionals now. Mm-hmm. And most of those people are fairly successful and known people. So it's really interesting to how much of that, and that's almost a different, when you look through the eras of comics, the era of these people that could sort of communicate and feed off each other in the late '90s became a generation of comics. And it's sort of, I think there's a lot of us that are still working, but I think there's also the younger generation that's I don't know I don't know enough about the younger folks coming in now to speak to what their background is, but there was a generation of, guys in their 40s like me who who all sort of came up together online, which is a really weird and an interesting place. And anyway, sorry, long story long. I had, I made a lot of friends that worked in the business, and a lot of people would encourage me based on my prose to try my hand at scripting, and I was lucky enough at that time to be working in the the first .com boom, to where I didn't really need to, not that I was loaded, but that I was comfortable, certainly for a young 20-something, early 20s person, to where I wasn't, I wasn't chasing it. And so I was able to sort of calmly sit and type until I was happy, basically, and figure out what I liked and what I didn't like. And it was also, manga was blowing up back then, and I wasn't the hugest manga guy, just in that I didn't have the focus to really follow as much of it as there was. But I remember being very compelled by how different, manga is obviously 100 different things, so I hate when people speak of it as a genre, because
right.
It isn't. But certainly the things in the books that I was reading that I found very compelling is the pacing was very different, the structure was very different, and it was much less. I think Paul Pope years and years and years ago said that comics is all about sort of a big. Well, I think I'm conflating two things that two people said, but the idea basically being that American comics is all about sort of a almost like a setup and a reveal and what the hook is, and manga is about selling you on a character, and you'll follow that character to the ends of the earth if I can get you to love that character, you'll follow that character forever. Mm-hmm. I found that very compelling. That it was less like, oh, what's the twist today? What's the weird plot hook?
Right.
That the commercial is going to sell me on. And I found very compelling just to sort of to be able to have quiet moments or things that were just less just high concept. Mm-hmm. And that definitely went into that early time and me figuring out what my voice was going to be, and figuring out like that there was a lot more that was outside of just genre hooks that was going to be important to what I was doing. And ultimately I did a couple things that I was happy with, but had friends in the business who encouraged me. And weirdly, out of nowhere, Mike Oeming, the very first thing that I ever collaborated on, really, on a larger, I'd done smaller things, but was Mike Oeming asked me because he had been mostly drawing and wasn't confident in himself as a writer. Now he's a very accomplished writer since then, but he asked me to write the Cross Bronx, and he had these loose outlines of things that he thought should happen in it, and I sort of reworked those and added characters and added, just sort of worked with him to make an actual comic story out of it. And I sat and I must have written that first issue in a couple days.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed it so much, and especially working with Mike, who is such a great and such a visual storyteller, that weirdly enough, that work, even though that wouldn't get published for a few years later, that work ended up getting me work with other smaller publishers. And then weirdly enough, it all sort of revolves around the Cross Bronx, because then when the book was finally published, it was so well received that I would end up getting phone calls from like Marvel and DC to ask me to do things for them. So
that's great. So did you meet Mike on Jinx World?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I met Mike there. And Mike, I mean, I was in New York, and Mike was Mike was deep in Jersey at that point. Now he's in Portland. Mike was traditionally a Jersey guy, and he would occasionally make it out here. And then I met him, I think, at a signing. We again communicated online, but then I met him first at a signing, and the next thing you know, we were just sort of hanging out every time he was out here. So it was just a fortuitous situation, and this happens often in comics, where people who are somewhat like-minded have similar tastes, or at least not even similar tastes, because I think Mike and I have very, very different tastes, but have maybe complementary voices.
Sure. I was just going to say, I do think you came up in one of the most interesting times in comics, just because, I find the Warren Ellis forms to be one of the most interesting times in comics, just because there's so many people there, like Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue DeConnick and Chip Zdarsky and a million, Jamie McKelvey, Kieran Gillen, a million other people that were, kind of stem from those forums. And all these people found each other and started kind of, combining and forming collaborations and everything like that. But beyond that, you talked about manga. I mean, it was kind of a weird time for comics, because Marvel and DC were both down, and, Vertigo really kind of, became Vertigo during that time. And there was, Wildstorm was going crazy, and et cetera, et cetera. And then manga was coming over. It was just, it was I hate to use this term, I always feel icky using it. It was a real period of disruption for comics. And it was a time where I feel like it became this melting pot of influences, where kind of comics, I again, hate using this, but it's it grew up and became something different than it was before, over that 5 to 6 year window. I mean, even Marvel did it with Marvel Knights. Marvel Knights was a huge moment for Marvel, and I guess Ultimate was in there too. But it was a really interesting time, and it sounds like you kind of had exactly what that was delivering type experience in there.
Yeah, I basically came up right around that time. So I even though the weird situation is maybe it was 2, maybe 3 years between when I first started reading comics again and when I was working in comics. Mm-hmm. So that thing sort of happened very fast, and I was right there in the middle of when it started to explode. And when I first started working, Bendis had just been when I first got on the Bendis board, which was literally maybe a year before I started working, Bendis had just been hired by Marvel. Mm-hmm. I remember you mentioned McKelvey. I remember literally the first comic pages he ever drew. Mm. And Jamie, Jamie's old now, but at the time, Jamie started drawing very late in life, in his 20s. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that a lot of those people really came to life in that disruption. I think for a lot of folks, there was a lot of stuff. I try not to second guess what the publishers are doing, because who knows what the hell their motivation ever is. But I think there was a lot of because everything was sort of failing on a business level. I think there was a lot more potential for people to take risks and to be sort of more free in what they were doing. And I think for me specifically, because I never grew up. I never really sort of came up in that period before that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to do my sort of weird stuff even at Marvel and DC because that was what it wouldn't occur to anyone to hire me to do anything different because I just wasn't that guy, you know?
Right. Yeah. You weren't kind of pigeonholed. You could still be yourself because comics were
Right.
just in this weird period.
Yeah, you wouldn't hire me to do. I mean, you might, but to do some random fill-in issues of Green Lantern or something, or you might, but you would know that those were going to be a little atypical.
Yeah. I actually, yeah, I want to talk just about a couple projects you've done over your time.
Sure.
Before we get into verses, you've done a fair amount of big two work. You've done some license work. You've had creator-owned projects like Drifter and Viking, both with Nic Klein, who is a god of artists, and I love his work so much. That's unrelated. I just wanted to add that personally. Obviously every project is different, but I'm kind of curious about Men of War. I know that's kind of a random thing to bring up, but it was part of this huge New 52 initiative. You were part of it from day one.
Yeah.
One of the things I find interesting about it is and I'm not saying that this is like a deliberate rebellious choice or something like that, but you haven't done a lot of big two work since then. Was that an experience that changed at all, like what your feeling was about making your own comics, like the appeal of that?
I honestly, I wouldn't say that because I guess now that you frame it that way, I can see why it would look that way. Like it sort of drove me away from the big two. That's definitely not the case, but really the timing just happened to be where, the image stuff that I've been doing all along and continued to do even while I was at the big two,
Right.
that stuff finally became viable. And we ended up with this second wave of like image success, where, a lot of us who had been stubbornly putting out books in a vacuum, basically, where people wouldn't necessarily buy them, um, finally had a chance to make a living,
Right.
these books. And so at that point, it just became obvious to me that that's what I wanted to do. It's also, I'd also been doing, I don't remember, I'd been working for what, 15 years, 14 years, something like that at the time. And it was just clear that my interests as a reader and as a writer were much more in line with the kind of stuff that I was getting to see come out of Image. And this is going to sound like a plug for Image, but I think Image is really, I don't think anybody would argue that Image is the strongest force right now for that kind of original, quote unquote, genre content.
Mm-hmm.
And just that opportunity, it became, and I obviously, look, I've been working a long time. I've got a lot of really fantastically talented friends, and it was much more appealing to make books with people like Esad and Nic and so on, that we could just really 100% control.
Right.
The timing just worked perfectly. It wasn't really anything about the relationship with Men of War, which I enjoyed, but Men of War was also a tricky situation because it was just, it was, the New 52 in that era was there were a lot of things being tried, and I was grateful for being the person that they tried that experiment with, but they weren't really wired to speak to an audience outside of, of their books.
Mm-hmm.
And that really, we didn't really have the outreach that we needed to get to. We had a lot of like smaller, we had venues of like military magazines, that sort of stuff that got really interested in it. And we had, at the time, in the past, like there's been, like, people used to buy comics on military bases. There's a proud tradition of military folk reading comic books, and I was really excited to sort of try to plug into that. But it was just, unfortunately, it was an uphill battle, and I ended up leaving that book after 6 issues because it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to do what I had wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you mentioned about how, like, military bases sell comics and everything like that, because you were talking earlier about how like you would jump into a book and then you'd get an issue that was like a few issues later and you'd have to kind of piece together what was happening. One of my best friends, like my best comic book friend, he grew up on military bases, and like it was very spotty what comics they would get. So he'd get like X-Men number 16 and then X-Men number 22, and he'd have to kind of piece that together. And so I just thought that was funny that you brought that up. I think people forget that that's a thing, but
Yeah. People, there's also, I don't remember the name of the group that you can donate your comics to this group, because, I mean, people are super hungry for that. You know, people who are deployed, really hungry for comics.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I really wanted to be involved. It didn't quite work out, and then the timing, it wasn't like that pissed me off and I walked off, but it was like the timing was perfect for me to focus more on the creator on stuff. And then once I was knee deep in it and I was able to make a living with it, there wasn't just I mean, this is going to sound sort of crass and commercial, but I mean, once I started making more money on my own creations, there's no way I'm going to take a pay cut to work on something for someone else. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, like right during that period was when Sean Phillips and Ed Brubaker signed their exclusive contract with Image, and there's a reason why. I mean, if they can if Ed can make more money doing Kill or Be Killed instead of Captain America, why not?
Right. Even if it was the same money.
Right.
I mean, there became a point where the Image books were much more lucrative for creators than Marvel books were. And at that point, it's hard to ask those people to work on, something that they don't own, that, T-shirts and towels are going to be made out of without, any incentive for them, versus, not that it's all about T-shirts and towels, but you know what I'm saying? I mean, if something's being made out of your efforts, then like, if you can capitalize off that, if people want towels with your drawings on them, then you should be able to, to pay rent with that. So.
I do think that I actually wrote a huge piece on Image's history for a website this year, The Ringer, and it was like between like 2000, like people think about Image as like this big thing that's always kind of been big, but between like 2009 and 2011 was really when it kind of escalated to a point where what you're talking about, where it was kind of like it started with Chew and then it like finished with Saga, and that point it was like, it was much more viable for creators to make money off of it in a significant way. But I want to talk about one of your projects there, Drifter. This is the last question before Versus. I swear, there was a comic I was a big fan of, but it was also your longest project and your most recently completed creator-owned one. How much of a guide was that when it came to figuring out how you wanted to handle both Versus and Black Cloud with Jason and Greg and everybody else?
I mean, honestly, not as much a guide, because the weird thing about comics is the more you learn, I mean, I think I'm good at a lot of things on a logistical level in terms of just the flow of a book and just the production end of it, but there's just not the unique chemistry that each of these books has, both on my end. Just what my process is very different in all those books. And also just what the artists are going to bring to the table, and and the whole team. But really, the basic structure of the thing is like what I'm able to produce and what the artist is able to produce before anybody else gets to their part of it. And that is so different on all of those books that it's really hard to apply much from one to the other.
Right.
I'm dumb enough that I don't, I do a lot of these things, not as a lark exactly, but I just, it's just sort of what I find most exciting at that time. And so I'm not going to not do my next thing because I don't think it logically makes sense out of some, because I learned something, or because I think I learned something more practical on a book, I'm just sort of going to run with. We do these books, like, Black Cloud was Jason and I over years, probably 2 years before Greg even came on board. Just talking about what we wanted to do, and we were just always going to do it.
It's not calculated.
It's not. There's obviously a lot of calculation once you get involved with it, but it's not. Those whims are just like, we're just a bunch of creative dopes, and we just don't know how to do anything differently, so we just sit and do it until it's done.
Sure.
And it's weird because I think the timing of Black Cloud ended up becoming Black Cloud. There are themes in Black Cloud that I think really accidentally ended up fitting in with the era that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really just a whim of ours and just some really fun idea that we really connected with.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could say the same thing about Verses in some ways, and we'll get to that. But I do, the one other thing I want to say about Drifter is I find it really fascinating. It's your longest project you've ever done at 19 issues.
Yeah.
I mean, comics are notorious for being a medium. Well, at least they used to be notorious for being a medium that was very long-winded story-wise. Yeah. So is that like is that a personal preference for shorter runs, or is it just kind of how things worked out?
It's a little both. I think, I'm sure I will inevitably end up on my doing something like a Wicked and Divine or something that I think there's some really amazing long form work. I'm a huge fan of Scalped, for example, which I don't know what it ran, like 50, 60 issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some great stuff to be done. I think not every story works in that way, and you can read it. It's the same in television. You can see after a couple seasons that people start to repeat themselves or start to sort of flounder and are just sort of making a show just to make it rather than inspired by, the natural momentum of the story. And I don't really ever want to get, I mean, look, it's a great problem to have. If you ever gotten a thing that was so successful that you had no choice but to keep doing it, or you felt that way, then, it's a good problem to have. But I think it's, from my perspective, I tend to think the majority of my ideas have been fairly complete ideas, although they end up being pretty amorphous in terms of like the entire story doesn't come to me so much as like the bones of a thing that I can squeeze a lot of extra things into if I need to,
Mm-hmm.
That actually was not the best way to express that, but, I'm just saying, I think that I know beginning and middle and end, but there are the steps you take on there. And that sort of goes back to what I was talking about with the manga stuff, like the steps, the journey can go a lot of different ways. And that part is like in the moment, the most interesting thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, when we originally thought Drifter would be even longer. And then we got to a point where we realized that like we knew exactly where we were going. And there wasn't anything really super essential that we'd be missing if we sort of started nearing that end and started telling that sort of revealing the secrets of the world. And in fact, we would probably be intentionally fattening it up if we didn't do that. Mm-hmm. It made much more logical sense for us to end where we ended, and so we did. But I can see, I have a story that my schedule is a nightmare right now, so I'm not able to do it. But there's a story that I've been playing with for a while that I think might have longer legs, but who knows? It's one of those things. Once you sit down with it, sometimes it feels shorter, sometimes it feels longer than you think it did.
Yeah.
I mean, the beauty of this is like really touchy-feely hippie kind of thing to say, but once you're writing these characters, the characters tend to have inclinations that you didn't necessarily imagine, and they sort of tell you what they want to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of books you can tell that where it's just like it started as one thing and then it kind of evolved into something else, or vice versa. I mean, like, yeah. And it is interesting too, though. It's like you were talking about how. Like length, there is a lot of books that are really long that may not necessarily, they didn't necessarily need to be so long, and there's the opposite of that too. So it is an interesting and fascinating fine line. A really random question: is Sebastian Gerner editing Versus?
Yes, he is.
Okay, I was going to say, because like I know he's done a lot. I was going to reference Berserk, which he is a super fan of, and he actually sent me the first 2 volumes of that. Like, one of the interesting things about manga, as in terms of length, is like some of those books are like prohibitively long. It's like you look at like Berserk, which I think is like something like 80 something volumes or something, and it's kind of astounding. I'm always amazed by the length of some manga series.
Yeah, well, I think you got to also, the a lot of these things are the way we package them in the U.S. for a much more collector mentality. Japan is not a collector mentality at all.
Read
Uh,
based.
yeah, and so we're doing these nice volumes that are $20 plus, and in that case, yeah, 80 volumes is a lot, but
Right.
for them, these are just like sort of basically newspapers.
Hmm.
And for them to read that much, it's not even because they're not looking at it from the perspective of they're just looking at this is what I do this week. I need shit to read this week. and,
Yeah.
and here this is, and I really like this. And it's just, it's just like watching however many seasons of The Simpsons there have been,
Hmm.
that's just what they do. That's just part of their habit. And we were weirdly, I don't know if it's, I think weirdly think the DVD boom and the big comics collector 90 thing sort of happened around the same time where people just started building their homes into weird nerd shrines,
Right.
which previously hadn't been. You used to watch a movie and then that was it. You were done. That was your experience. If you were lucky, you might run into it in some other format, but you didn't store every experience you've ever had.
Right. Renting became owning at some point.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's true of comics too. Like you own these things, but there weren't these single issues. Like trades, first of all, didn't really come into play until the late '90s. There were editions, but it wasn't a market
Hmm.
until the late '90s, early 2000s. So it's a very, very for Marvel and DC especially, it's a very, very modern um, thing. Are these trades? So, for people just to store these things and to own them forever, they would have these single issues and they'd sit in a box somewhere or they'd get rid of them or they'd be given away or whatever it is. But the experiences were somewhat fleeting.
Right.
Uh, and now everything is permanent forever.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's not how these books are in Japan. In Japan, it's a long experience and you're taking the journey and it's almost like you're on this long trip with them. Um, and, and it's a much more of the moment thing.
Not to slander Western comics. I would rather read. One of my favorite comics ever is 20th Century Boys by Naoki Urasawa.
Yeah.
And digest size, it's amazing, very inexpensive. And then I also have like omnibuses. And I can tell you what, omnibuses are terrible to read. I hate to be that person who's saying it, but they're like so massive. Like sometimes I like to read in bed, and so I'm reading in bed, and these omnibuses are like crushing my sternum as I'm trying to read it. It's an awkward combination.
No, you're right. I just saw that DC just put out this Fourth World thing, and I love the Fourth World, and I have, from when I was working there, I have the previous 4 volume set that they put out. Um, and yeah, I looked at that and I was like, for a minute I got jealous because I'm not working there anymore. I don't get the books anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm like, who's going to read? Like that thing weighs 50 pounds.
Right.
It's not a way I want to read things like on the train. I want to read things like in the park.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's talk verses. I'm gonna to start with. I'm gonna try to give a synopsis. Feel free to jump in if you think I'm butchering it.
Sure.
The idea behind it is, and this is directly from the solicit. War has become a spectator sport. It's as sponsor states find a fund to armies that battle for our entertainment. The book follows one of the biggest stars of the game as he deals with injury and rising rivals. The thing that honestly, I actually didn't read the solicit before jumping in. I just saw your guys' names and I was like, of course I'm gonna read this. And I loved the first issue. I thought it was fantastic, and not knowing anything about it was actually kind of jarring because I was like, oh wait, this is happening. Oh my god, it was kind of blowing my mind as I was reading it. But I find it to be a really interesting book, both for its story, but also for its origin story. Like, it was announced at Image Expo. I was actually at the show box when you announced it. You did fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
It started off as one team, creative team, with Yves Forcina, and I may have horribly butchered that name on colors, but then Nic Klein is now painting Esad's
Yeah.
work. What was the evolution of it? What was the origin story of Versus, and how did it develop once you started getting it together?
Well, the path was complicated based on any number of factors in my schedule and Esad's schedule. Esad Esad had when we originally announced that, Secret Wars, which he had been working on, was supposed to be it was supposed to end much earlier than it did.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately it didn't, and ended up taking 4 or 5 months longer than what he'd originally thought he was getting into. There were complications in general from that, and you've seen the book. It's not a thing he can fake. It's not a thing he can rush.
No.
So it just sort of takes how long it takes. In terms of the colorist, I mean, the colorist was, we had an original colorist who had been the colorist that Esad had been working with at Marvel previous to that, who's a local guy that Esad sort of had picked way back when as someone that he could sort of work with more directly, more hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
And Eve just wasn't really available anymore. And we, once he wasn't, we got really intensive with what, I mean, I had a vision of what the book was going to look like even before that was going to be difficult to pull off. And we went through, there were a couple different incarnations of who we thought were going to work with on the book. And once we right around the last issue of Drifter, when I realized that the schedules were probably going to be able to line up, I mentioned Nic to Esad, and it just became obvious that could be the only answer.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's just no offense to any other colorist, Nic is a actual world-class painter, and there's just not a lot of guys who are able to just on a technical level pull off what Nic can pull off. And because Esad also comes from that world, it was just a natural, they can speak a language that isn't really possible in a normal comics coloring scenario.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like, I think a lot of the work that people think of for really loving Esad's work is stuff that he painted himself. And so there's a difference in what somebody like Nic can handle versus, like, not like from a qualitative standpoint, but from like an actual delivery of color standpoint versus a more traditional comic colorist.
Yes. And it's just not, and again, I work with some amazing Matt Wilson, who's working with me right now on Black Cloud. I've worked with incredible colorists. There's this sounds like a Trumpian statement, but there's no greater champion of the comic colorist than me.
Right.
But there is just the depth of things that Nic can do that I don't really know almost anyone else who can do.
Mm-hmm.
So once we had access to him, it was just like a no-brainer. It's like hiring the best cinematographer you can hire for a movie kind of thing. Like there's just not a lot of guys who can do what he does. And so we wanted to do something that lived up to maybe or came as close to living up to his painted work, Esad's painted work, without it being, it doesn't look like his painted work either. Mm-hmm. But we wanted it to be the most sort of potent version of his non-painted stuff. And I think that comes across. I mean, this is for sure, and again, no offense to anyone, but I think when you look at it, it's for sure the most beautiful version of non-painted Esad stuff. And I honestly think it is on par even with his painted stuff. It's just different.
Right. It also has like a much different texture than the original preview pages you guys had rolled out. And it's the nature of how Nic approaches his colors.
Yeah, and it's fun to watch them work together, and it's also like Esad can be a curmudgeon and doesn't always love what happens to his art. So it's fun to see him actually marvel for a second and be excited by something.
Yeah. So how did the story itself develop? And like once you had Esad on board, like did it kind of change and find different permutations as you guys kind of moved along?
No, well, actually, it wasn't a question of having him on board so much as a question of, like, we had been talking about working together again with the confluence of this correct era. I really thought it did not make sense that Esad had not been doing this kind of work, and I've been sort of twisting his arm to do that kind of stuff. And I was literally, the most pretentious thing I can say, I was wandering through I was on an extended trip. I had to go to a convention. I was in a convention in Italy, and I had to do a convention in the UK a week later, and so I literally just wandered through 800 miles through the north of Italy for a week to kill. And I just wandered into this store and just saw this thing. Uh, I just was wandering around, and something visually inspired me, and I called him, and I think I literally just said Space Gladiators was the first thing I and and we just started. I had a really rough idea of something that I wanted to do in that first conversation, and he and I had talked about doing uh, this concept that I can't really explain without spoiling the entire first arc of Versus. But he and I had talked about doing a thing a long time ago um, that we realized would plug really well into this concept. So we just sort of merged both stories. Um, and so it's not a question of me sort of developing a story and then handing it to him. He was definitely involved at every point in the process, and that's sort of how I prefer to work.
Sure.
I don't. Look, I've been around the block enough times and worked with these guys, knowing how. I try not to say this in a sour way because I know some of what I've said today might come across as sour, but um, I I know that a lot of these times these guys don't have a ton of freedom on the books they're working on, and I know that they are, when you're a kid and you think you want to do comics or whatever your youngest form of that is, and what you envision doing and creating is not necessarily what the process allows you to do once you get in there. And modern scripts are very, very dense and very um, controlled.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, whatever I can do to create an environment where an artist is genuinely creating the story and genuinely really riffing and expressing themselves how they want, I want to do that just for selfish reasons because that's going to create the best work. And then everyone's going to pat me on the back for this brilliant comic, but it's really just this artist who is doing the best work of their career because they finally had the opportunity to build something.
So are you suggesting, and listeners are not going to have seen this, but just imagining the most amazing futuristic vista of road systems you've ever seen in your entire life. That's in the first issue of Versus in a 2-page spread. So you're not saying that you wrote out every single detail for Esad to...
Oh, no, absolutely not.
I was just kidding. It's astounding. I mean, that's one of the things about Esad that's so incredible is like, he's not somebody that leaves details to the imagination necessarily because his imagination realizes it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That scene is just a car ride. That's all I wrote. It wasn't. I didn't write the expansive vistas or any of that stuff. I mean, the irony is when you get into it, you'll see. I mean, no one's going to see the script, I guess, but there are things that I meticulously tried to describe only because I thought it would, like I was almost trying to like arm wrestle with him. Like he designed something insane, so I tried to throw something insane back at him, and then he would just throw something back at me of the thing I expressed. It was so much better and so much crazier than anything I'd written down that I'm just like, oh Jesus, I can't even keep up with this. Like it's not. There's no way the depth of the stuff. Like and even when he does work for hire stuff, he brings way more to the table than anyone's asking him for. And so giving him just full reign to literally design a world is like, and look, he can explain to you exactly why the world is built the way it is, the practicality of the environment, things that absolutely were not discussed with me, that he just has a perfect vision of how everything functions and why it functions that way. And he's also a giant nerd in terms of like he reads more than anyone I know. He's a futurist. This really allows him to stretch those muscles in a way that people wouldn't necessarily know about him.
Mm-hmm.
He made me read a book about mind mapping just to get into this. So no, he definitely he is a genius in more ways than one, and I'm literally just doing the barest minimum I can to to keep his fire stoked so he can just create these incredible environments.
It is pretty cool. It sounds like you guys are kind of not that like you're intentionally like pushing each other, but it's like you guys are kind of going back and forth because he comes up with something big and then you want to come up with something big, and it's like it kind of, I mean, it's perfect collaboration. It's exactly what you want because you want to bring the best out of each other.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm holding up my end of the bargain. But no, I think that's look, and again, and this is as a guy who's been doing this a long time. I didn't always start out that way. I think I was a lot more flexible than some guys are, but it's definitely my modern version of how I work is pretty much that. I don't, most of my scripts usually have a disclaimer up top, which just says that, even when I get specific with visual descriptions, I mean it to be, for you to absorb it the way you would absorb reference, which is basically just something to inspire you and then to be discarded as you create the actual environment from your own preference. So the same for Nick, it's the same for Greg. There's details in there that I think are important story wise, so I will make sure to put those in there. But it is largely just to, in Hollywood, the equivalent of me doing a line reading for someone, which is telling someone how a line, the inflection reads in my head, but not for them to do it that way, but just for them to understand what the emotional motivation is.
Sure.
So they can just do whatever the hell they want to do.
I do, one thing I wanted to bring up to you is I think it's really interesting how, you're talking about like the level of detail and like how you've kind of evolved, how you write your own scripts for artists and everything. But I do think it's really cool that you've kind of worked throughout your career with the same people a lot. Like Nick, you worked on Viking and Drifter before. Tom Mueller worked on Drifter. Is he on Black Cloud? I don't remember.
Tom's been on all my books for like 10 years.
Yeah, that guy is just astounding. He's so good.
Yeah.
Oh, and he also did Viking, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, and then you've worked with Annie McDonald in the past. Collaboration is obviously an essential element to comics, but how do you feel that like repetition and familiarity help with like the creative process and bring out the best in your work when it comes to comics?
I think that there's a shorthand that you can have with that person.
Sure.
Or, language, just conversation can be tricky because you think you know what you mean and you think the other person's going to know what you mean, but it doesn't always turn out that way. So there's a shorthand that people have when they understand each other past a certain point that I think is extremely valuable, just in terms of just not making mistakes. And look, honestly, like my definition of a mistake in comics is very loose. I think there's a lot of things that happen in comics that might not suit, and we've done it in all of my books. That something will come on the page that is not at all what I meant, and I work around it because it's just better, So, but obviously you do want to understand each other as much as you can. You do want to make sure that you also know the parameters of how the relation. I mean, the comic is like a marriage. It's not. It's a lot of attention that you have with each other. There's a lot of trust that has to go into it, and if you think the other person's an asshole, that's not good.
Right.
So you got to find these situations where that A, you work well together, that you think the product is going to be good, but B, that the experience is going to be good. And honestly, the other tricky thing is like with artists and writers specifically is like scheduling and that sort of stuff. Working relationships can become really, really tricky, really, really fast. And a lot of times people are like, oh, this is young genius that nobody ever worked with. And what they don't realize is that young genius only produces like 10 pages a year.
Right.
Even if he's being paid to do 1,000. And, until you get into those situations, you don't know what you're walking into. And so there is a familiarity of, there's sometimes when Marvel, and this is not a good example because all guys I'm working with are amazing, but, there's sometimes you'll see with Marvel that they work with a guy who not everybody loves. And they're like, why do they keep going back to the guy? And they keep coming back to him because he turns his pages in.
Right. Yeah.
They don't have to worry about that guy. And that's, that is an important part of it too. But I mean, with these guys, that's not the case. Obviously, everyone loves these guys. These guys are fucking geniuses. But I know more or less what our relationship is going to be. I know more or less how to communicate with them. And I know that ultimately, when all is said and done, we're going to make a book that I'm going to be at least proud of their part of. And And that's about it. I mean, when you guys have guys, I mean, those are the three guys you mentioned are three of the most inventive um, and dynamic artists I can think of, and so I just get spoiled, and I end up going back to it.
Yeah. I also think it helps too that like I mean you hadn't worked with Esad before, right?
No, we did little stuff together.
Okay.
Um, he's done a lot of covers for me over the years, and he did a really short thing with me in 24/7.
Mm.
But yeah, we've never done a longer form thing together. No.
But so you knew Esad going into it. You knew Nic. I mean, like as an outsider, it's like there's part of you that's like you see that those two are working together, and you're like, wow, that might be like a really unique alchemy because they're both incredible artists. Like, what if one's personality starts dominating or something like that? But I imagine you knowing both of them makes you more comfortable going in that like everything's going to work out in the end.
Yeah, well, they're both really close friends of mine on a personal level. And they know each other.
Hmm.
Um, they've met before. I think through me, but also through Nic has done work with Marko Djurdjevic's art company, who I think has also done stuff with Esad. I don't remember exactly, but they've met, in Europe also before, um, and they get along. So I mean, I definitely knew that that relationship was going to work out. I also know that Nic is not. Um, it's tough too because I'm also as much as I'm open to a lot of things. I'm also very uh, I can be a pain in the ass. I know what I think looks good and what I don't think. You know what I'm saying? I know
Hmm.
what I think works and what doesn't work, and I'm going to push until I think we get there. And so I know, that Nic might want to strangle me sometimes, but I know that he will ultimately get the thing and agree to do. If what I'm arguing about is ultimately the right call, he'll work with me to get there.
Yeah.
So that's important too. I mean, there's I have a very I can be a bit of a zealot of what I think is the right finished product, and I know these guys will work with me to get there.
Sure. He knows it's not ego. He knows it's you looking for the best thing for the comic.
Yeah, absolutely. You tell me to remove all the text from a page, I will gladly. That's the right move. It's definitely not. It's not. I mean, it's ego in that I'm ultimately someone has to decide that they think that they're right and about something to approach another person to change or to adapt or to whatever. So there's that degree of ego, I guess. But for the most part, it's like I don't. You could take my name off the book. I just want the best book. You
Right.
know.
So I just have a couple more questions. I want to talk about one of the most interesting things to me about the book is the fact that it is in a lot of ways like you're watching a sporting event quite often.
Yeah.
It's and I'm kind of curious about the level of collaboration that's necessary for this book versus other ones, just because you're not just integrating like design is so important to this book in the way that Tom realizes the commercial breaks and like certain elements like that in not this is like the lightest of spoilers, but there's a substitution in the first issue, like the way
Sure.
that those types of things are realized, like so you have art and design being very closely integrated along with the way that you're scripting it. Do you find
Mhm.
that this book has a higher degree of close collaboration than other projects you've worked on?
Yeah, and I think that also, I mean, the version that you've seen is not the final version, so I think that will also morph
Okay.
as we get closer to our print date, which is in February. I think you'll see like some of that design will, and not nothing drastic, but you'll see that we will finally all sit down and fine tune.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, no, this is definitely a very close collaboration. We have everybody's involved at almost every stage. Everybody opines, even um, like there are long discussions about just what color the text is in the balloons,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. So no, we're definitely very very involved with everything, and that will only become more so to Tom's chagrin as we get closer to finishing, because I mean, as you can see, it's a very designed book on the graphic design end,
Mm-hmm.
and it's once we get into like having to do all the interstitials in the pages, that framed the book, that's only going to be more intensive for him.
Right. I was gonna say that like it's for Tom it seems like on the low end of involvement there's like just like I'm gonna design a logo, and then on the high end there's something like this or like Motor Crush where he's kind of really kind of being part of the world building by delivering in this case like well I guess kind of in both cases like sports like elements and like commercial break type elements.
Yeah, when we started originally, like Viking, he would just do 24/7 was the very first thing we did together, and he designed the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
To nuts. Viking, he did I believe, just the type treatment. He would lay out the covers, but we would design the actual book interiors. I think I don't remember exactly that one, but I think with the trades, for example, like Nick drew like hand lettered everything that was inside the trades, for example. So that actually didn't end up being Tom. Tom helped to put the stuff together and did all of the cover work, but Nick did the interior stuff. But the Tom, I mean, my preference is for Tom to be as involved with the entire thing as possible. If and by the way, Tom, I'm pretty sure that's Tom's preference too. I think
Mm-hmm.
Tom would like to as much freedom. Like, there's no way comics could afford Tom anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom is a very, very high end London designer, and there's no way comics could afford him at his rate anyway. So once he's in there, if you give him something that he can be proud of, I think he'd rather like you'll see we're doing a variant cover for each issue that is basically Tom just remixing some of Esad's stuff in a way that really is beautiful.
I loved what he did on Drifter, where he had the different grid systems for
Yeah,
the covers and everything like that. Like, I think that's like an element that some people don't notice and how the lines and everything are kind of developing as the series goes along. But I loved it.
yeah. And that was all him, by the way. He. I mean, again, all him an extremely harsh taskmaster commenting along the way. But he the Drifter, like him deciding to change basically the logo format within each volume, that was entirely his idea.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted to ask about sports. Did I know you did? I was reading that you did like a lot of research. It sounds like part of it was Esad guiding you or telling you to do this stuff, like where you were reading about like mapping minds and things of that sort, which I thought was really interesting. But I was curious, did you just like have to sit down and like watch sports or esports to kind of get a feel for the flow and how that all works from a visual delivery standpoint? Because I know it's war, but at the same time, I mean, it's gladiatorial combat. It's like modern sports.
Oh no, I didn't. I honestly didn't do that. I mean, I've watched.
A fair
I've
amount,
watched.
anyways.
I'm not as big of a super fan as some. I've watched a lot of basketball in my day, and a fair amount of baseball. New York, obviously a big baseball town.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I have enough of familiarity with it and I also never want anything to feel exactly um, like an analog for a real world thing. I want to put my spin on it, and I want to present it in a way that feels familiar, but that is not necessarily accurate.
Sure.
Um, so a lot of it is just me just playing off my experience of what it is and what I want to express, and a lot of it is there's a fair amount of, it's not a comedy by any stretch, but there's a fair amount of absurdity
Yeah.
to some of it. And so some of that is just what I want. What I want that the commentating and that sort of stuff. What emotion I want that stuff to evoke.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see as they go further, a lot of it is reactive too. A lot of it is like Esad will do something especially crazy in an action sequence that I didn't intend or consider, and they'll be reacting almost with my voice in terms of their surprise at what's happening.
That's awesome.
So it's a lot of it is just honestly like versus the we're trying to package some interesting, hopefully, interesting perspectives into something that almost from a distance might look like this very sort of bro-y, battle book.
Right.
And so we're just like the same way Sopranos was this very abstract. Not that this is going to be that abstract, but I'm saying like, Sopranos to some people was just a
gangster show,
gangster shoot 'em up, and it wasn't at all that. So we're sort of trying to play with the idea of like what you can do within the parameters of something that people might see as just a punching match.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about narratives in general is the fact that like you could read verses just as this like entertaining yarn about future sports, or you could read it as like almost thematic commentary on modern society. And your mileage may vary, but it's going to be a great experience either way. I love stories like that.
Yeah. Well, you'll see also like the first issue is fairly quote unquote masculine, but you'll see that there's a reason for that, and you'll see how that affects the story.
Right.
And yeah, we're having a lot of fun with, and it's also another book that accidentally became topical, and you'll see more in later issues why some of it may feel much more timely than it was when we were originally discussing it. But I just think we're just I think we're unfortunately at a time in our country's history, or in the world's history at this point, where I think sci-fi is just going to have no choice but to be smashing up against the present.
Right. Absolutely. Last question I have, I wanted to ask about, we talked about how in like the, late 90s, early 2000s when you're in, it was like this exciting boom moment for like where everything's, you're starting to get into manga, you're starting to get all these other things. But now in 2017, we're kind of at this moment where there is just so much competition for comic fans' interest, both within comics and outside of it, that it can be hard to kind of get the attention necessary. Black Cloud seems like it's kind of, you've really succeeded with that. It's found an audience. People are really passionate about it. But for you, like how important is it to, sorry, I'm horribly phrasing this, but obviously I'm interviewing you now to promote the book, but how important is promotion to creator-owned in your perspective? Or is there only so much you can do to like make sure that Versus gets in the hands of people? Like, sorry, that's really poorly phrased.
No, I got what you're saying. I think it's true that there is only so much you can do, and I also think that there's look, you want to be passionate about the book, and the book ultimately is going to speak for itself. Right. But it is important, and I think we are in an interesting world, but we're also in a world that is drastically changing at a level that I don't think most people are paying attention to, where, you have younger kids now are listening to cassette tapes again. And like there are kids who are almost the huge ratio of noise and sort of modernity of the way storytelling has evolved. People are almost bristling at that and almost craving, I think, something more simple, tactile and simple. And I think that is interesting. And I think that that's something that, like, I think largely publishers are being reactive, and they don't 100% understand what the modern marketing world is. I think that they, and that's true of, by the way, publishers, creators. I think that's true of all of us. I think we're all hoping to get buzz going, but no one really understands what buzz means or how it happens. Mm-hmm. So, you try to get your things out there, and hopefully the thing is exciting enough that people get to it. You want as much people to at least glimpse what it is, so that if it's exciting, they can be excited by it. But the whole thing's a work in progress. So I do think it's very important. I have a publishing imprint that I think about this a lot with. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very tricky conversation. I think it's also a conversation that, like, I think that there's some young geniuses out there who are really going to understand this stuff at a level that most of us don't. I think there's a real interesting world for them to there's a real interesting there's an opportunity for them to do really huge things, because I really genuinely think that in comics the majority of marketing in comics is just to put ads in other comics, which is like, it's like going to a restaurant and telling them, yo, you like food, go to my restaurant. Like,
Right.
it's just, it's this very reactive and passive thing. And in the old days, like, if you wanted people to find something, you had to find an audience from scratch, you know, for your product or for your comic, for your story. And I think that we're at a bit of a distance from that, and we largely only know how to be reactive and just sort of how to package things to our existing audiences. And I think that that's probably the most boring and least productive way to handle it. And so
Right.
I am very curious to see what, as things shift in this current new generation, to see what that becomes. Because I also think kids largely don't, not that it's all about kids or the versus is for kids per se, but like the next generation that people are always going for is kids, and I don't think kids give a shit about anybody's marketing.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm very curious to see how things go.
I also think that to a certain degree, that's there's a generational thing where it's almost like we're being trained to be suspicious of marketing, and probably fairly. But I think that comics are really in an interesting place because, like, you've seen the boom of, like, Raina Telgemeier and Kazu Kibuishi and all kinds of other people who do comics for the younger generation. I'm kind of curious if there's like a certain level of what you're talking about with like the cassette tapes and like the vinyl boom where younger people are turning more towards the elements of a simpler time, and comics are almost part of that because that's what kids read in like the 50s and 60s and everything like that, and maybe it's kind of getting a little bit of that wave too.
I think so. I think it was an emotional decision, and I'm not sure I could put my finger on it. But I've been reading digitally for a few years, and I've recently shifted back to reading things on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just something that felt right to me, so I did it. But I think that's it's a very interesting thing that's going on. I don't know that I understand completely why it's happening the way it is, but I do know that it can be overwhelming. I think I get asked all the time. People send me books constantly to read them and give them a quote or to promote it or to tweet about it or whatever it is. And I think if every writer is just tweeting every day about all these amazing comic books that just they happened upon, that's fairly suspicious.
Right. Yeah.
Perspective, I wouldn't believe that. So I think that I think people are not getting their information from that. I think they're getting their information from, I don't know where exactly, but I think that is evolving, and I think that people are consuming things in much, much different ways.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to say is it's funny tying back into the New 52. I think part of the reason why Image had it as big of a boom as it did in 2011 was weirdly because of the New 52, because you had so much like mainstream marketing dollars from DC going into places that comics aren't normally seen, and it drove people into comic shops. And I think in a lot of ways they ended up discovering things like Saga or The Walking Dead or Chew or whatever. And it's kind of interesting how that worked out. It was like the last time you really saw a major influx of marketing money going into not comics or going into not comic related things. And I think that was a major boom.
I think that's part of it. I also think probably part of it is I think that was a time of huge flux for the big two.
Sure.
And there was a lot of relaunching and rebranding and whatevering. And I think that I know a lot of retailers that were pretty scared by that,
mm-hmm.
in terms of just not knowing what to do with their dollars, because they'd put money behind one book and then a few months later it would become a different book and then so on and so forth. And I think, if a lot of those creators that they'd come to trust on those books had went off and did original works, did their own stuff, those teams tend not to change. If you get Sex Criminals, you're pretty sure, it might not come out as often as you like or whatever it is, but it's going to be Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky. You know that they're going to love it. You know that when they come out to do a signing, they're going to do very special things. They're also going to do signings, which they wouldn't necessarily always do for. So you had this audience who was primed for work by these guys, and suddenly had those creators doing probably the best work of their careers, certainly the work they were the most invested in.
Sure.
And sure, books get canceled just like anywhere, but for the most part, if you follow those guys, if you follow Wiccan and the Divine, you might not know exactly where the story is going to go, but you know what you're getting in terms of like the commitment. You know more or less what the voice of the book is. You know that these guys are going to travel the world to support it, and so on and so forth, which is not necessarily like what they would do if they were working on Spider-Man.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think that timing also worked out to where like people were in flux and they didn't quite know what the hell to do, and then found these things that were much more not ironclad, but you know what I'm saying. They're much more. There were no variables in the Image books,
Right. Yeah.
on where the story might go, but you weren't worried about that there was going to be a new number one suddenly instead of a number 7 or whatever it was. You weren't worried about those variables. You knew more or less that if you kept behind these things, the story might get weird, but you knew what you were getting.
Yeah. I do think that in 2017, we're definitely in well, it's soon to be 2018 when this actually runs. We're in an era where it's like people follow personalities more than they used to. It's like, you know, especially like as somebody who writes about comics online, a lot of people will read my stuff if I'm writing for, let's say, I don't know, Newsarama, or if I'm writing for a larger site like The Ringer or something like that. They'll follow me to those places because they like my work. But besides that, they may not read The Ringer or Newsarama. And you see that with like, I don't know, all kinds of other fields and everything like that. And I wonder if creator owned is just kind of, I mean, it's part of that boom too. It's like people are following personalities because they love their work and they know that they can trust that they're going to be putting out work that they like.
Right.
But,
exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's what I was going to say. So you can be, whether or not anyone likes every one of my comics, you can be sure that we're making something that we're proud of and that we're putting our hearts into. And I think that that's something that hasn't always been true about everybody's job in comics, you know, historically. So I think that this is a really unique time, and people are really spoiled for riches in terms of like just the amount of quality content that's out there right now.
Yeah. That reminds me of, I'm also a disciple of Warren Ellis in some ways. I Come In Alone. I don't know if you ever read a CBR column they used to do back in the day. That was like the single biggest influence for me as far as like writing about comics, because nobody writes about comics better than Warren Ellis, because nobody writes better comics than Warren Ellis does. But he talked about how the best way to get more good comics is to just make more comics, because there's going to be a natural volume rise in both. And I think we've kind of seen that. Like, we have an incredible amount of good comics, but there's just also an insane amount of comics these days.
Well, that's what I think a lot of the guys who came up of the generation, my generation, Image, your Fraction or Remender, whoever, like those are guys who had to continue to put comics out at a time where they weren't necessarily selling, and it didn't make good business sense to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the reason that we all stubbornly did that, was realizing that at some point, if we kept shouting at the heavens with these comics, that people would eventually notice, and people would eventually realize that these you know, there was cool stuff going on in the U.S. market, and hopefully they would show up, and now they have.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for everyone to see your next work, Versus, coming February 7th from Image. Pre-order it if you haven't, and you're gonna love it, I swear. Ivan, thank you for coming on and chatting with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Ivan Brandon. You can find him on Twitter at Ivan Brandon, on his website at ivanbrandon.com, and in comics like Black Cloud and the upcoming Versus, which arrives in comic shops everywhere February 7th. If you're a fan of the show, this is big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Andrew Scott, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Benjamin Birdie, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Abraham Reisman, Adrian Diaz, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Michael Perlman, Phil Nile, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Carl McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corgan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abbott, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening and tune in next week for another episode.